We didn't start the war, but when it came, it found us sleeping, with factories cold, soldiers untrained, and a nation convinced it had already seen the last of the world's madness. September 1939. Poland burns. France mobilizes. Britain declares war. In America, the news arrives between baseball scores and swing music on the radio. In diners across the Midwest, farmers read headlines about Europe's latest crisis over eggs and coffee. In Detroit, assembly lines produce Fords and Chevrolets, not tanks. In New York, the World's Fair celebrates the world of tomorrow. Streamlined, peaceful, American. We thought distance was safety. 3,000 miles of ocean. 2 coastlines separated by a continent. The wars of Europe were their problem, their ancient hatreds, their endless border disputes. We'd solved that problem in 1918, lost 116,000 men doing it, and sworn never again. The American Legion held rallies against intervention. Mothers wore buttons. Keep America out of foreign wars. Senators gave speeches about Washington's farewell address. No entangling alliances. Charles Lindbergh, the nation's hero, stood before crowds and said what millions believed. These wars are not our concern. President Franklin Roosevelt watched Europe collapse and saw what was coming. In fireside chats, his voice came through crackling radios into living rooms across the nation. When peace has been broken anywhere, the peace of all countries everywhere is in danger. But we didn't want to hear it. The Neutrality Acts tied our hands. No arms sales to belligerents, no loans, no involvement. We would remain pure, untouched, safe behind our ocean walls. Then France fell. June 1940. The unthinkable happened in 6 weeks. The French army, the largest in Europe, collapsed. German tanks rolled through the Arc de Triomphe. Newsreels showed the evacuation at Dunkirk, and for the first time, Americans felt a tremor of doubt. Britain stood alone. Night after night, German bombers pounded London. Edward R. Murrow's voice came across the Atlantic. "This is London," followed by the sound of sirens and explosions. Americans listened in their homes, trying to imagine their own cities burning. Roosevelt moved carefully. The isolationists were still powerful, but he began preparing anyway. He pushed through the Lend-Lease Act. We would be the arsenal of democracy, lending Britain the tools to fight, not joining the war, just helping. Congress debated. America mobilized slowly, reluctantly. Young men were drafted under the Selective Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. They trained with wooden rifles and trucks marked tank, because we didn't have real ones yet. Factory owners received quiet inquiries from the War Department. Could you retool? Could you produce bombers instead of passenger planes? Tanks instead of tractors? Not now. Just be ready. By late 1941, we were a nation holding its breath, watching the world burn, praying the flames wouldn't cross the water. We had 11 months left to sleep. Sunday morning, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Pacific Fleet lay at anchor in the morning sun. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all lined up in perfect rows. Sailors ate breakfast. Officers attended church services. It was supposed to be a quiet day. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave arrived. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes swept across Oahu like a steel hurricane. The attack lasted 2 hours. When it ended, 2,403 Americans were dead. The USS Arizona lay at the bottom of the harbor with 1,177 men entombed inside. The USS Oklahoma had capsized. 18 ships were sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The news reached the mainland in fragments. Radio broadcasts interrupted Sunday afternoon programming. Families gathered around receivers, unable to believe what they were hearing. Operators repeated the same incredible sentence. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. In Washington, Roosevelt met with his cabinet. His face was grim. The debate about intervention was over. The decision had been made for us. Monday, December 8th. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His voice was steady, clear, angry. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The vote for war was nearly unanimous. One dissent. 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. We were in it now. All of it. 2 oceans, 2 wars, enemies on every horizon. That night, across America, factory lights came on. Assembly lines that had been slow or stopped roared to life. Machine shops that made household goods began retooling for weapons. Shipyards expanded. Aircraft plants added shifts. The giant was awake, and it was furious. The transformation happened faster than anyone thought possible. America, the sleeping industrial power, became a hurricane of production. January 1942. The War Production Board took control of the economy. Factories converted overnight. General Motors stopped making cars and started making tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines. Ford's Willow Run plant began producing B-24 Liberator bombers, 1 every 63 minutes at peak production. Women flooded into factories. The men were gone, off to training camps and overseas deployments. So their wives, sisters, and daughters took their places. Rosie the Riveter became the face of the home front. Welding, drilling, assembling bombers and battleships with hands that had never held a wrench. They worked 12-hour shifts. They learned trades in weeks that used to take years. They built planes that their husbands would fly, ships that their brothers would sail, tanks that their sons would drive into battle. Every rivet was a bullet. Every welder spark was a gunshot fired at the enemy. By 1943, American factories were producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Liberty ships launched from shipyards faster than U-boats could sink them. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Ammunition plants ran around the clock. The numbers were staggering. 300,000 aircraft, 89,000 tanks, 3,000 naval vessels, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. America had become a machine for making machines. But production wasn't enough. The materials needed soldiers to use them. Training camps erupted across the country. Farm boys from Kansas learned to fire rifles. College students from New York became navigators. Factory workers from Detroit became tank commanders. The peacetime army of 1940, 174,000 men, expanded to over 8 million by 1943. They trained in deserts, forests, swamps, and mountains. They learned to kill and not be killed. They wrote letters home, full of bravado and fear. They tried not to think about what was coming, because everyone knew the war was going to be long, brutal, and unforgiving. May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea. American and Japanese carriers fought at distances so great they never saw each other. Aircraft launched into empty sky, hunting enemy flat tops by instinct and luck. The USS Lexington went down, but the Japanese advance toward Australia was stopped. June 1942. Midway, the pivotal moment. American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment, refueling and rearming on the flight deck. In 5 minutes, 3 carriers were burning. By evening, a 4th was sinking. The tide turned. Japan went from offensive to defensive. But defensive meant fighting for every island, every reef, every coral atoll across the Pacific. November 1942. Operation Torch. American soldiers landed in North Africa, expecting glory. They found German 88mm guns, experienced Afrika Korps veterans, and brutal desert warfare. Green troops learned hard lessons in sand and blood. By 1943, the pattern was set. Grinding, incremental advances bought with lives. Sicily, Italy, the slow crawl up the peninsula through mud, mountains, and German defensive lines. At home, families lived with rationing. Sugar, meat, gasoline, rubber, all limited. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards. Children collected scrap metal. Housewives saved bacon grease for munitions. Gold stars appeared in windows. Each one meant a son, husband, or father who wasn't coming home. The war wasn't an adventure anymore. It was a national crucible, testing everything we thought we were. By 1944, the war had become industrial slaughter on an unprecedented scale. The innocence of 1941 was gone, burned away in the furnace of total war. Italy, 1943, 1944. The campaign that was supposed to be quick turned into a nightmare. Monte Cassino, the Rapido River, Anzio. Soldiers fought in snow, rain, and mud that swallowed vehicles. German defenders occupied high ground, dug into ancient monasteries and stone buildings. Every yard gained cost blood. There were no heroes in the trenches, only survivors. Men learned to sleep standing up, to eat cold rations in freezing rain, to ignore the screams of wounded they couldn't reach. They wrote letters home that said everything was fine, knowing their mothers could read between the lines. Medics treated frostbite and shrapnel wounds with numb hands. Chaplains gave last rites so often the words became mechanical. Officers made impossible decisions: which hill to take, which lives to spend. American B-17s and B-24s flew daylight bombing missions over Germany. The theory was precision bombing: hit factories, rail yards, military targets, save civilians. The reality was different. Bombs fell on cities. Dresden burned, Hamburg burned, Berlin burned. Strategic bombing became indistinguishable from terror bombing. Bomber crews flew 25 missions, if they survived that long. Many didn't. Flak tore through aircraft. German fighters picked off stragglers. Men bailed out over enemy territory and spent the rest of the war in POW camps, if they were lucky. For every German city we destroyed, a piece of our humanity went with it. Guadalcanal, 1942 to 1943. Marines landed expecting a quick victory. They found jungle, disease, and an enemy that refused to surrender. The fighting lasted 6 months. Men contracted malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever. They fought in 100-degree heat and monsoon rains. They learned the Japanese would rather die than yield an inch of ground. Tarawa, November 1943. A coral atoll. The tide was wrong. Landing craft grounded on reefs. Marines waded through chest-deep water, while Japanese machine guns cut them down. 1,000 dead in 76 hours for a piece of rock 2 miles long. Saipan, Guam, Peleliu. The names piled up, each one soaked in blood. Marines developed a 1,000-yard stare, eyes that had seen too much death to register anything anymore. Then came the kamikazes, Japanese pilots diving their planes directly into American ships, willing to die if they could take sailors with them. It was warfare as suicide. There was no defense except shooting them down before they hit. The Pacific taught us the ocean could be as cruel as any enemy. It taught us that some men would never surrender, never negotiate, never stop fighting. It taught us that this war would end only when one side was utterly destroyed. June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Eisenhower wrote a letter taking responsibility in case the invasion failed. He kept it in his pocket as 156,000 troops loaded into ships and landing craft. Paratroopers jumped at midnight, scattered across Normandy in chaos. They landed in flooded fields, German positions, trees. They fought in darkness with whoever they found, trying to accomplish any part of the plan. At dawn, the first wave hit the beaches. Omaha Beach was a killing ground. German defenders occupied high cliffs with perfect fields of fire. Landing craft doors dropped and machine guns opened fire. Men fell into the surf, dragged down by equipment, drowning in 3 feet of water. Those who made it to the beach hugged the sand as mortars and artillery rained down. Officers shouted orders no one could hear over the explosions. Medics crawled from body to body, trying to save the savable. It took all day to secure the beach. Thousands died in those hours. But the beachhead held. Reinforcements landed. Supplies flowed. Within a week, the Allies controlled a slice of France. The gates of Europe were open. The cost was everything. 1945 dawned with Allied armies closing from east and west. Germany was collapsing, but the fighting didn't stop. Desperate men defended ruins. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 had shown the Germans could still bite, even while dying. Then American soldiers began discovering the camps: Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, places whose names would become synonymous with evil. Soldiers who'd fought across Europe, who'd seen death in every form, walked into the camps and went silent. They found walking skeletons. They found mass graves. They found gas chambers and crematoria still warm. Liberation photographs show GIs standing amid piles of bodies, faces blank with shock. They were men who'd stormed beaches and taken cities. Nothing prepared them for this. We stopped cheering. We started understanding what we'd been fighting. April 12, 1945. President Roosevelt died. Vice President Harry Truman, who'd been kept out of major decisions, suddenly found himself commander-in-chief with a war to finish. May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered. Church bells rang across America. People poured into the streets. Times Square filled with celebrating crowds. But the joy felt incomplete, restrained. The war was only half over. Okinawa, April-June 1945, the last major battle before the planned invasion of Japan itself. It was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. Kamikaze attacks intensified. Hundreds of suicide planes dove at American ships. The destroyer USS Laffey was hit by 22 kamikazes and bombs in 80 minutes. It survived. Barely. Many ships didn't. On the island, Japanese defenders fought from caves and tunnels. They used civilians as shields. American casualties mounted. 12,000 dead, 38,000 wounded. Japanese losses were 10 times higher. Military planners looked at Okinawa and calculated what invading Japan would cost. Their estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties. The Japanese had 2 million soldiers on the home islands, plus millions of armed civilians prepared to fight with bamboo spears. Truman faced an impossible choice. The Manhattan Project had produced a new weapon, a bomb that used atomic fission to release energy equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT. Tested once in the New Mexico desert, never used in war. Truman made the decision. August 6, 1945. The Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber, took off from Tinian. At 8:15 a.m. local time, it released its payload over Hiroshima. A flash brighter than the sun. A fireball vaporized everything at ground zero. A mushroom cloud rose 30,000 feet. An entire city destroyed in seconds. 70,000 dead instantly. Tens of thousands more dying slowly from radiation. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The silence that followed those explosions was different from any silence before. The world had changed. We had changed it. For the first time, victory felt like sin. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. 1945 to 1946. The war was over. Soldiers came home. Ships docked in San Francisco and New York to cheering crowds. Ticker tape parades filled streets. Families reunited. Life tried to return to normal. But nothing was normal. The men who came back weren't the boys who'd left. They'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, done things that couldn't be undone. They struggled to explain to people who hadn't been there, and eventually stopped trying. They got jobs using the GI Bill, went to college, bought houses in new suburbs, started families, tried to build the future they'd fought for. War crimes trials convened in Nuremberg and Tokyo. The world attempted to assign guilt, to create justice from catastrophe. Nazi leaders were hanged. Japanese generals were executed. It felt both necessary and insufficient. America emerged from the war transformed. We'd mobilized our entire society. We'd outproduced the world. We'd deployed the most powerful military in history. We'd invented the atomic bomb. We were the richest nation on Earth, the only major industrial power whose cities hadn't been bombed. Our factories hummed. Our economy boomed. The American century had begun. But we'd also learned what we were capable of, the destruction we could inflict, the moral compromises we could make. 16 million Americans had served. 400,000 hadn't come home. Each death left a hole in a family, a community, a future that would never exist. Truman addressed the nation as the first nuclear age dawned. We have used atomic power in order to shorten the agony of war. Our responsibility in the world is great. The mushroom cloud became our symbol. Power and horror, victory and guilt, the ability to save the world or destroy it. We'd entered the war to end tyranny. We left it holding the power to end the world. The war lasted 3 years, 8 months, and 7 days for America. In that time, we lost innocence, gained power, and learned the terrible weight of both. We didn't start the war, but we finished it. And in finishing it, we became something we'd never been before. a superpower with global responsibility, nuclear weapons, and the knowledge that sometimes victory and tragedy wear the same face. The generation that fought came to be called the greatest. They rarely called themselves that. They'd simply done what needed doing, survived what needed surviving, and come home to build a world where their children wouldn't have to. Some nights, though, they woke from dreams of beaches and jungles and burning cities. Some days, they heard bomber engines in distant thunder. Some moments, they remembered faces of men who didn't come back. The war was over, but it would never really end. Not for them, not for us, not for a world that learned humanity could reach both its highest heroism and deepest horror in the same 4 years.